In 2009, in the coastal town of Ashland, Maine, 17-year-old Sarah Lawrence lived in a house that looked like it had been lifted from the cover of a family magazine. A white picket fence framed the neatly trimmed yard. The mailbox bore the family name in elegant embroidery, and seasonal flags fluttered from the porch in orchestrated celebration of every holiday. To passing neighbors, the Lawrence residence seemed warm, safe, and dignified, like a symbol of small-town American decency. Inside, though, the atmosphere was something entirely different. The house felt heavy, suffocating, as though the very walls absorbed sound and returned only silence. Every conversation was filtered, every movement evaluated. Emotions were a private threat. Crying was seen as weakness, questioning as rebellion. Sarah learned early that the appearance of peace was more important than its reality. Her mother, Sharon Lawrence, was a respected figure in the community. She taught high school literature, organized annual charity fundraisers, and wrote a weekly column in the York County Ledger titled The Power of Family. People admired her poise, her intellect, and her seemingly unwavering devotion to her children. They didn't see the way she corrected Sarah's posture at the dinner table with the flick of a fingernail, or how she paused a conversation to adjust the volume of her daughter's voice mid-sentence. They didn't hear the whispered threats that followed behind closed doors. At home, Sharon's standards were non-negotiable. The family had to represent something: discipline, excellence, harmony. Sarah became a silent reflection of this campaign, molded into an image that never felt her own. Her father, Daniel, was present in name only. A civil engineer who worked long hours and came home smelling of old concrete and diesel. He moved quietly through the rooms like a man avoiding attention in his own life. He rarely defended Sarah. His silence was a constant hum, louder than any outburst. Her older brother Tom had left for college in Boston years earlier and never came back. He answered texts late and called only on holidays, but Sarah never blamed him. Escape, she understood, was its own kind of love. In the absence of allies, Sarah turned inward. She began keeping a hidden journal, tucked beneath the third drawer of her desk. There, she recorded the private landscape of her home, the shredded report cards, the erased voicemails, the nights when her drawings were torn in half because the colors clashed with the dining room palette. She wrote down everything: the moments Sharon rewrote emails from teachers to improve the tone, the time she doctored Tom's high school transcript for a scholarship, the way she humiliated her husband for chewing too loudly during dinner. Her mother called it weakness filtration. Sarah called it something else, but never out loud. The journal became her only place to breathe fully. There were nights when Sarah would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun slow and useless. The wooden beams overhead felt like the ribs of a coffin. In the darkness, the well-staged home became a place of containment rather than comfort. The air held everything that had never been spoken, and Sarah, with her quiet footsteps and obedient smile, learned how to vanish without ever leaving the room. By the spring of 2010, Sarah had settled into a quiet rhythm that revolved around her evening classes in journalism and a part-time job at the York County Records Office. The position had seemed mundane at first: filing deeds, scanning microfilm, maintaining rows of dusty cabinets filled with tax reports and building permits. But there was something oddly soothing in the order of it all. The silence of the archive felt cleaner than the silence she had grown up with. It didn't demand perfection. It simply existed. What drew Sarah deeper, however, was access. Her ID badge unlocked more than just filing drawers. It opened a digital system containing decades of municipal records. Under the pretext of verifying residential plots and conducting historical indexing, she began to input her own last name into the system: Lawrence. At first, it was idle curiosity, a glance at property taxes, census data, school district files. But then she started noticing patterns: lines that didn't add up, dates that jarred. She found a loan issued in her name, dated back to when she was 15 years old. It had been quietly repaid within months, but the paperwork showed her forged signature and a cosigner listed as Sharon Lawrence. The lender was a small credit union, the kind that didn't look too closely. Sarah stared at the document for an hour, feeling something harden inside her. She checked the system again, this time focusing on property ownership. According to archived city maps, the family home was originally registered to her maternal grandmother. But several years ago, ownership had been transferred to Sharon. No will, no probate file, no court filing. Just a notarized shift that appeared clean, but carried the smell of something buried. Over the next few weeks, she searched deeper. Building permits filed for repairs that had never been done. Renovation grants that had been claimed but not used. A handful of names repeated across various applications. Friends of her mother, former students, board members of Sharon's charity initiatives. The picture that began to emerge wasn't a family legacy of integrity, but a complex, meticulous web of image management and financial manipulation. Sharon had curated not just a household, but a brand, and she had done it using pieces of other people's lives. One evening, while organizing old storage bins in the attic crawl space of her rented apartment, Sarah pulled up a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small plastic box taped shut. Inside, she found a mini cassette recorder, its buttons dusty but intact. Alongside it were several tapes, labeled in handwriting that was unmistakably her father's. She played the first one at midnight, wrapped in a blanket and lit only by the glow of her laptop screen. What she heard wasn't surprising, but it still made her hands shake. Shouting, doors slamming, her mother's voice sharp and rehearsed, like a lawyer backed into a corner. Her father's voice, quieter but trembling. Her own voice, once, crying in the background. The recordings were dated over a 2-year span. There were references to money, accusations of hidden accounts, moments of silence so thick they seemed louder than the screaming. Sarah copied everything to her computer and hid the originals beneath her mattress. The next day, she sat in the campus library and stared at her screen for hours, scrolling through templates for exposés and digital storyboards. If her mother had spent a lifetime building a flawless portrait, then Sarah would build the mirror. Not just to break the illusion, but to reflect the truth back at those who helped maintain it. In the weeks that followed, she drafted outlines, assembled timelines, organized evidence into folders labeled not by event, but by type of betrayal. She knew now that her mother didn't just manipulate perception, she restructured reality. And for the first time, Sarah understood that fighting back wouldn't be about confrontation. It would be about illumination, letting the world see what the light had never been allowed to reach. In 2011, Sarah's grandmother passed away quietly in her sleep, just before dawn on a Sunday. Her name was Evelyn Cole, and to Sarah, she had been the only person in the family who ever spoke without calculation. Evelyn had seen through Sharon's layers, but never openly challenged them. Instead, she carved out small sanctuaries, afternoons with books, handwritten letters tucked into Sarah's school bag, slow walks through her rose garden, where the air was heavy with silence, but never suffocating. Her absence hollowed something permanent in Sarah's chest. The funeral was held 3 days later in a white clapboard church at the edge of Ashland, surrounded by bare trees and half-melted snow. Sharon treated the event like a stage production. She arrived early with a full makeup kit, changed into her third choice of coat, and began directing people where to sit for photographs. At the gravesite, she asked the funeral director to wait so she could adjust the lighting for a group picture. She made Sarah stand beside her with her hand on the casket, insisting they smile because Evelyn would have wanted celebration, not grief. Sarah refused. For the first time in her life, her voice didn't come out hushed or tentative. It came out sharp. She stepped back, folded her arms, and did not smile. Sharon's expression flickered, not with sadness, but with controlled rage. The camera still clicked. The photos would be cropped. No one would ever see the moment that cracked the surface. The next morning, Sharon was gone. Her car had vanished from the driveway, and Sarah found a note on the kitchen counter in the exact center of the marble slab. It listed a flight number, a vague excuse about meetings in Boston, and a reminder to settle the remaining funeral invoices. There was no expression of thanks, no mention of grief, no acknowledgement that Sarah, barely 20, had just buried the only person who'd ever made her feel seen. Left alone in Evelyn's house, Sarah sorted through closets and drawers that smelled of lavender and thyme. She found old grocery lists written in cursive, letters tied with string, and journals Evelyn had kept about the town's history. But she also found receipts, dozens of them, records from banks and charities, notes scribbled in margins about money that never reached its destination. There were old envelopes addressed to Sharon with checks still inside, never cashed, but recorded as received. It was Evelyn's quiet form of protest, saving the proof. Sarah withdrew from university the following week. She sent one email to her journalism professor, stating that she would not be returning. She didn't give a reason. Instead, she took a full-time position at the city records office and moved into her grandmother's house. The place was quiet, but not in the way Sharon's home had been. It welcomed silence. It listened. Over time, Sarah collected more than documents. People began to speak. Former students, disillusioned parents, frustrated colleagues. At first, they spoke vaguely, lowering their voices even in empty rooms. Then came emails, scanned letters, whispers turning into statements. Sarah cataloged everything. She filed complaints, highlighted inconsistencies, mapped timelines. She wrote by hand when she needed to remember something clearly. She digitized stories that no one had wanted to admit out loud. Under the pseudonym Lighthouse Daughter, she launched a blog. The name came from Evelyn's favorite phrase, "Be the light that doesn't blink." The blog's first posts were cautious, stories without names, records blurred, dates softened. But readers found them. People commented. Others reached out with their own stories. The entries began to stack up. One teacher sent a typed letter describing a decades-long pattern of manipulation at Sharon's school. A former volunteer from Sharon's charity confessed to helping funnel funds to cover personal expenses. A retired board member admitted he had signed grant forms without reading them, trusting Sharon's version of the truth. Eventually, Sarah stopped withholding names. She added citations, direct quotes, photographs, audio clips. Each post was dated and documented. Some were shared hundreds of times. Others disappeared into the void. But together, they formed a counter-narrative to the mythology Sharon had built, a growing archive of the shadows behind the perfect light. The Windlight Festival had been a tradition in Ashland for over a decade, born from an idea Sharon Lawrence had once sketched in the margins of her school notebook, and later pitched to the town council as a way to celebrate family as the cornerstone of community. Lanterns strung between telephone poles, booths painted in pastel shades, children's choirs and photo contests, every detail bore her signature. Over the years, the festival had become inseparable from her public identity. This year, it was to be bigger than ever. Sharon had been nominated for York County Woman of the Year, a title that came with statewide recognition, a plaque presented by the mayor, and a filmed tribute aired during the ceremony. Sarah returned to Ashland 2 days before the event. She booked a modest room in a bed and breakfast on the edge of town and avoided visiting her childhood street. Her name wasn't on any guest list, and her presence wasn't announced. Officially, she had come to attend the event as a former local, as a journalist doing coverage on regional honors. Unofficially, she had come to finish something. A month earlier, Sarah had contacted an investigative reporter from Portland. She sent her a secured folder filled with digital evidence, recorded conversations, financial spreadsheets, internal memos from school board meetings, anonymous testimonies, redacted letters from whistleblowers. Together, they traced a network of ethical breaches that stretched across schools, charity boards, and neighborhood associations, all orbiting Sharon's influence. It wasn't embezzlement on a grand scale. It was something subtler: influence, pressure, quiet deals, favoritism traded for silence. The kind of corruption that hides behind holiday cards and dinner parties. With the reporter's help, Sarah arranged for the files to be published online at the exact moment the festival tribute would begin. But she also needed one more piece: visibility, a moment that couldn't be ignored. She contacted the municipal technician responsible for audiovisual production at town events, a quiet man named Julian, whom she had known in high school. He agreed, hesitantly, to help her reroute the final segment of Sharon's tribute video to a pre-uploaded file. The change would be seamless, indistinguishable, until it was too late to stop. On the day of the festival, crowds gathered at the community park. Balloons bobbed gently against the wind, and folding chairs filled with families spilled out past the perimeter of the tented stage. Sarah arrived just before the sun began to set, wearing neutral clothes and carrying nothing but her phone and press badge. She didn't speak to anyone. She found a spot near the back, half shadowed by a row of vendor carts. The air smelled of kettle corn and fried dough. Children darted between legs. The mayor stood near the stage steps, rehearsing her speech. When the moment came, the lights dimmed and the crowd fell into a hush. A screen lowered from the canopy above the stage. The announcer listed Sharon's achievements in reverent tones: 22 years in education, founder of 2 regional initiatives, volunteer at the food bank, mentor, mother, moral compass. Polite applause followed each point. Then the tribute video began. It opened with the expected: photos of Sharon in classrooms, holding scissors at ribbon cuttings, laughing beside civic leaders. Soft piano music played. The room leaned into comfort. At the 60-second mark, the screen flickered. Then it changed. The music cut to silence. The image faded to black, then reappeared, this time showing a scan of a disciplinary letter written in Sharon's own hand, heavily redacted, with notes in the margin reading "delete this" and "they'll never push it." The next image showed email correspondence with a teacher, thinly veiled threats about evaluations and job security. A voice recording followed, Sharon's voice unmistakable, saying words no community leader should say. Manipulations masked as policy, dismissals cloaked in righteousness, anger sharpened into persuasion. The transitions were smooth, the pacing deliberate. Each piece bled into the next: bank transfer screenshots to her personal account, private notes about students who were too disruptive to showcase, text messages to council members pushing for favorable votes in exchange for public flattery. The silence in the tent grew oppressive. No one moved. The air itself seemed to stop. When the video ended, the final image on the screen was simple: a table of names. People affected, silenced, erased. At the bottom, a watermark: Lighthouse Daughter. For one long minute, the crowd remained still. Then the mayor stood and exited the tent without a word. A group of parents followed. Somewhere near the front, a man began shouting. Someone else cursed. Sarah stayed where she was, unmoving, until the sound of the microphone hitting the floor echoed through the speakers. On stage, Sharon had collapsed. A volunteer knelt beside her, calling for help. In the chaos that followed, sirens, gasps, flickering lights, Sarah stepped away from the crowd and disappeared into the evening, the wind lifting the edges of the banners still strung across the trees. The screen was blank now, but the silence it left behind said everything. In the weeks that followed the Windlight Festival, Ashland changed. The transformation wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. City officials announced an internal review into the York County Women's Initiative, citing concerns about mismanagement and ethical violations. The local school board issued a public statement distancing itself from Sharon Lawrence, noting that her tenure, while long and decorated, would be subject to retrospective review. Her community foundation, once a pillar of family-oriented outreach, had its accounts frozen pending investigation. Staff were placed on leave. Projects were quietly shelved. What had been whispers for years turned into written words. An open letter began circulating on social media, eventually picked up by regional news. It bore dozens of signatures: former students, faculty, teaching aides, community volunteers. They wrote in plain, unembellished language about humiliation framed as discipline, favoritism masked as structure, silence traded for opportunity. Their stories weren't exaggerated or theatrical. They were precise, careful, weary. One described how Sharon had publicly shamed a student for stuttering during a class presentation. Another recalled a forced resignation, issued after a young teacher had pushed back against arbitrary grading changes. The most common thread was fear, the long, consistent sense that speaking up meant erasure. Sarah watched the fallout from a distance. She declined every request for comment. Journalists left voicemails, emails arrived daily, and a local radio show even left a handwritten note at her grandmother's door. She answered none of them. Her voice had already been spoken, not through interviews or television appearances, but through years of documentation, digital ink, and a resolve that didn't need a camera to be heard. Instead, she returned to her blog. The layout remained simple. White background, black text, the lighthouse logo still glowing in the corner. One new entry appeared, brief and deliberate. It read, "We are not required to wear the masks others choose for us, not even when the mask belongs to our mother." She posted it without a title. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times. Days passed quietly. Then, on a Thursday afternoon just before dusk, Sarah received a message from a number she hadn't seen in years. It was her father. The text was short. He was in town. He wanted to meet. No explanations, no demands. They met at the old pier where Sarah used to walk with Evelyn on late summer evenings. The wooden boards were weathered, the paint chipped, but the view of the bay remained the same, quiet, wide, and gray-blue under a sky that never quite turned gold. Her father stood near the railing, his hands in his coat pockets, his posture slightly hunched, as if the years had bent him slowly forward. He spoke first. His voice was quieter than she remembered, lined with something heavier than age. He apologized for the silence, for the way he'd left her alone with the weight of things he hadn't dared to carry. He said he'd seen the stories, that he believed everyone. He said he hadn't been brave enough, that he was sorry. Sarah didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, not from anger. There were no words she owed him. Instead, she opened her satchel and handed him a folder. Inside were printed pages from her 2009 journal. No cover, no commentary, just dates, entries, observations. The life he had lived beside, but never entered. He accepted it without question. She turned and walked back down the pier alone. Behind her, the wind lifted the edge of his coat, and the folder in his hands rustled softly, the pages flicking once, then falling still. The bay remained quiet. The town behind them kept turning, and the girl who had once been trained to smile on command no longer looked back. By the spring of 2013, Sarah had stopped writing about her mother. The blog still existed, its archive untouched, its final post remaining at the top like a closing breath. But she had moved on from exposing stories. Now she was collecting them, not for publication, not for judgment, but for preservation. She opened a small independent gallery in Portland, tucked between a used bookshop and a cafe that smelled of cardamom and pine. The gallery had no name painted on the glass, only a line of text printed in modest serif above the door. Here, too, there was sunlight. Inside, the space was clean, pale, and quiet. Photographs hung in neat rows, images of houses, doorways, staircases, and window frames. None of them dramatic. None edited for drama. Just still portraits of architecture in ordinary light. Places people had lived. Places where things had happened. Where voices had been muffled and then remembered. Each photograph was paired with a brief passage. Some were typed, others were handwritten. All were anonymous. One described a girl who had learned not to speak until she moved out. Another told of a boy who forgave his father only after realizing forgiveness didn't require a reunion. One image, a narrow hallway with peeling wallpaper, was paired with a single sentence. She didn't scream, but the silence was loud enough to bruise. No names, no dates, just fragments of truth. Fragments that had survived. The gallery became something wordless. People didn't come for explanations. They came to stand still. Some stayed for hours. Women drove in from towns hours away just to see their own stories in the quiet of someone else's frame. Survivors didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. They nodded at one another, lingered beside particular images, sometimes left handwritten notes on the pinboard near the exit. The notes were not always sad. Some were filled with gratitude. Some were simply drawings. One was just a leaf pressed between two pieces of paper. Sarah never held opening nights. No wine, no speeches. The gallery opened with the light and closed when it faded. She spent her days adjusting frames, accepting new submissions, and dusting corners no one noticed. She didn't take interviews. She never stood in the center of the room. When people asked if she was the curator, she shook her head and said she was just someone who made space for stories that didn't fit anywhere else. Her mother remained in Ashland. According to town records, Sharon hadn't left the house in over a year. She declined public appearances, returned mail unopened, and stopped answering the phone. The awards had been packed away. The foundation dissolved. The house that once hosted lanterns and speeches now kept its windows shuttered, even in summer. But Sarah no longer thought of that house. She had learned that the opposite of silence wasn't noise. It was presence. The quiet presence of someone standing before a photograph that mirrored a memory they had never spoken aloud. The gallery didn't offer answers. It offered recognition. And in that recognition, something softened. Not erased, but acknowledged. On the final wall of the space hung a single frame. Inside it was not a photograph, but a mirror. Plain, unpolished. Below it, a line etched into the frame read, "You made it out. No one took pictures there. They just looked. Some cried, some laughed softly, and some simply stood still, their reflection meeting them for the first time without fear." Sarah never asked what they saw. She only made sure the mirror stayed clean.